All right. Yeah, right on the dot here at 6. So happy to get started. My name's Emily Yoder. I am one of the co-designers along with Sebastian J, Grace Hwang, and Jared Cooper, who created the game Malign. So this talk is going to be an overview of the game design, some of the lessons learned as we continue to modify it, and just the applications of the game itself. So with that, I will try to pause for questions throughout, but worst case scenario, we'll do a long Q&A at the end. Slides are a little bit slow, I think. There we go. So just a little bit about me. I am a wargamer through Goose. That was the foundation from which this game was created. But for my 9-to-5, I am also a game designer. I am a policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. So I typically specialize in strategic and operational war games, but over the past few years, as gaming has really hit, I would say, somewhat of a zeitgeist, it's been expanding out to educational games, from resource prioritization, understanding different force postures, just across the full gamut. And I think it's continuing to grow. My background is international affairs. I specialize in international economic affairs. Can't say that I use the economics too much in gaming, but I always look for those opportunities. And just as a legal caveat, this presentation and the game itself and my opinions here aren't a reflection of my employer. The basic gist of it is if I say anything crazy, that's on me, not anybody else. And this picture is actually from one of the playthroughs of Malign in Helsinki, Finland for university students, primarily tech and communication students at Aalto and Laurea University. And I'll get into how these playtests went and some of the design adjustments as we go through the presentation. So what is Malign? In a sentence, it is a card-driven educational game with rigid rules where players must grapple with the pernicious effects of malign influence while attempting to foster social resilience. And I wanted to kind of break down the sentence. I have some words highlighted in bold. So I wanted to start with malign influence and social resilience. These are basically the attack and defense mechanics of the game. But malign influence, broadly, in terms of an educational perspective, is basically anything that one actor does to another to change the way that that actor thinks, speaks, acts, basically making them do something they otherwise would not do. And one of the easiest examples of this is disinformation. So weaving a narrative that shapes perspectives to favor one opinion over another. And social resilience, these are essentially the tools to counter malign influence. So this is detecting, mitigating, and possibly even deterring malign influence. So this is an easy example is fact checking. And in this game, they go head to head. And then going back to the educational component of this game, this, I think, is really important in understanding how the mechanics of the game were developed, because this game is intended to help people learn about malign influence and means of combating it. So I'll get into this a little bit later, but the way that the players interact in the game, as well as what they represent in the game, is very much a reflection of this educational component, as compared to something like a research game, or I would say an analytical game. Education comes to the forefront, and those other things may follow suit, but the game was designed at its core to be educational. And lastly, card-driven. This is the core mechanic of the game in terms of there is a board, there are placemats, there are little chips flying everywhere as I get into the details of the game. But the way that the players learn and interact primarily with the game is through cards. So all of the other assets of the game and the mechanics are shaped to reflect the player decisions that they make through those cards. And you can see from this picture that this game is very much a collaborative game. So players and teams are having conversations, and at certain moments throughout the game, the players are having conversations between their different teams. All right, so digging down into these mechanics that I've kind of talked about in that previous slide, the players themselves represent, I would say, 4.5 countries. And when you talk about educational games, like the way that I describe it is that the players aren't a specific decision maker. They aren't a president. They aren't the national command authority. They are essentially the overarching group responsible for making types of decisions regarding malign influence campaigns, as well as building social resiliency. These are very nebulous concepts, and one person isn't going to be making all of the decisions for running a particular type of campaign and how it looks. But because this game is educational, we give the players that overarching authority. So it's a very vague and nebulous representation because they are just the countries and their decision makers. And the countries themselves are designed to be very dynamic and flexible. So they themselves are also very vague. They give the players individual pieces of the puzzle, and it's up to the players to shape the narrative and fill out the story over the course of the game. So Ursaria is an authoritarian regime. Don't think too much about that anagram. Arden is a bipartisan democracy. Republic of Fluma, this is why I said 4.5. Fluma is a separatist region of Arden that has a growing independence movement. Presk is a negotiator. It's a complex and competitive multi-party system. And then lastly, Denesia is a former colony of Presk. Then it was an authoritarian regime, and now it's a brittle democracy. And all of these players and these countries have differing interests. So as you can see, there's territorial disputes, there's separatist movements, there's making and breaking alliances, and Ursaria kind of likes to sow chaos amongst them. And this is almost the amount of information that players get in the game. We read one-page narrative that highlights all of these countries and their loose interests, and we give the players another sheet for their country that tells them what their interests are and ultimately how you win the game. And over on the side here, you can see the way that we fill out these countries in the game is we lay out a map and we lay out different demographic chips. So this tells the players the composition of their countries in terms of what type of people live there, what are their political parties. And this isn't even like a detailed description. This is Citizens Democrat versus New Republican. And that's all we tell them. So the players themselves are thinking about what would a Democrat versus a Republican party draw look like. And then they have to basically draw upon their knowledge of what's going on in the world around them and shape those narratives themselves. So we give the players the structure and they like the skeleton and they fill it out over the course of the game. I'm going to hit on this a million times, but this is a very player-driven, narrative-driven game because we want the players to be engaged with the topic and think creatively. So this is what the map looks like. And these are the countries that the players are representing. I will not stick around on this slide too much because one of the cool things about having this talk right now is that Sebastian and I just finished an overhaul of the game and we're preparing it for publication. So we've redesigned the map. And I just kind of wanted to highlight some of the changes we've made recently and why. So this was the old map of my creation. Moving from left to right, Presk is the orange country represented by the horses. Ursaria is the sleeping bear. It's in red with the little bear in the logos. Arden is on the far right in the dark blue, represented by a tree. Fluma is to the north, and then the purple islands represented by a shark are Denesia. And I will go into some of the other components of this map on the next slide, which is this. So we had, in preparing this game for, hopefully better and brighter things, we had somebody go through and redesign it. I would say much more professional than I. And you can see that this is likely a little bit more aesthetically pleasing than the last map, and it helps players have a more structured approach to the board itself. So players are representing the countries, and you can see that there's the map in the bottom left corner, but there's also these, I would say, flowers, and these are population demographics. So this is where we fill in little chips that give the players an understanding of what their population looks like. This includes things like population size, religion, political party, ethnicity. We have options for education as well. And this is what the players are ultimately trying to influence. They build their stories to fit what these populations may or may not be interested in. So I have little arrows going to those. And I've mentioned placing the demographic tokens in the population demographics to set up the countries. And the petals of the flowers here are where the players place their influence over the course of the game, which malign influence, when players are successfully creating malign influence, is represented by little red wooden cubes. Building resiliency is represented by little blue cubes. And say, for example, if you are Denasia and you are influencing Fluma, so you're the shark influencing the tree in the river up in the top right, you would place whatever type of influence you choose to do within the little purple squares. And this is just for tracking how players are doing over the course of the game. We also have a score track wrapping around the board. And then we have the effects results table, which I'll get into this a little bit later because just reading off of it now is a little complicated without understanding the cards and the other mechanics in the game. And then I have a close-up view of the board. So this is what the players will be seeing on the next run of the game, which is very exciting for me. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. And if anybody wants to go back to this after the talk, more than happy to. So then getting to the cards. Like I said earlier, this is very much the core component that the players themselves are interacting with. And we have, I would say, 2.5 different types of cards. We have action cards. So these are things that are played individually at specific times in the game. So they trigger an immediate action, which is, pretty intuitive. So these are examples of this are leaks. So this would be if in the real world, this is like information that a country did not want out in the world is released intentionally by another actor to shape public perceptions. In the game, for example, this allows the players to see other players' cards. Hacking has a very similar dynamic. Honeypot is one of my favorite cards, so I have the definition of this on another side. And a very basic card mechanic that doesn't really have a reflection in the reality is drawing more cards. So there are some game mechanics that aren't a direct reflection of reality, but ultimately a gameism, and that's one of them. So all of the action cards either affect other players, so they lose cards from their hand, or they lose the element of surprise with the cards that they're about to play, or the player that activates the card. So this is things like drawing new cards or gaining information about other players and their intent. And then we have campaign cards. So this is where the players ultimately generate their malign and resiliency campaigns. Malign and resiliency campaigns. So this is played in a particular formula, which I'll walk through in the next slide. And then the players have to shape the narrative when they reveal their campaigns and activate them. So there are 3 different types of cards: intent, method, and what we've changed to be amplifier. Multiplier is a little bit confusing, which I'll show you why in a moment. But intent, method, and multiplier, or amplifier, sorry, are one of the characteristics of the card that helps shape the definition for players. So this slide essentially just walks through the two types of cards. So over on the right is an example of an action card. And this is something like this card is called active measures. We have a little icon to make the cards a little more engaging and fun. We have an indicator for whether the card is an action card or a campaign card. So this one clearly says action. And then we have definitions. So this is really important, I would say, because this game is educational and we don't want a barrier to the game and having players learn from it being just the fact that they don't understand what a card means. So all of the games that have reflections in reality are defined. And this was based on literature review, interviews, and we essentially just built this tool database that we translated into these different cards and categorized them into either actions or campaigns cards. And then, excuse me, we have the card effects. So this is basically how does that definition translate into a game mechanic? Because ultimately this is a game and it needs to function like that. So active measures, it's covert and deniable operations intended to achieve political influence. And the way that this translates into the game is that you get to remove 2 cards from any player's hands. So the way we thought about this was representing it as the other player that you're taking those active measures against loses the ability to have the element of surprise, as well as a little bit less flexibility in influencing other countries. So then moving to the left card, we have, of course, the card title, but up in the top left corner, there's an indicator for whether the card can be used as a malign card or resiliency card, because there are particular actions that are inherently intended to be malign, influencing someone or something to do something it otherwise would not do, or resiliency. So just an example is that you can't really use fact checking to be a malign influence. Within the definitions of our game, we've had some really good conversations with people about how you feel that you can use factual information or positive influences to change somebody's mind. But I would say that is particularly outside of the scope of our game. So this card, influencers, can be used as both. And this is, the definition is using influential figures to enhance the reach of your message. So with that definition, you can think about how influencers can be used positively for building resiliency campaigns, as well as negatively in terms of influencing others. And then in the center, we have symbology to help players understand how the card can be used in shaping their campaigns and their narratives. So triangle represents intent, and intent is what you're doing. Basically, are you doing a malign campaign? Are you doing a resiliency campaign? And we have some nuance and dynamics within those particular categories. So an example is a resiliency campaign. You can also be building social cohesion. For malign influence, you can do things such as creating social divisions. And those are all represented by a triangle. The pentagon is a method, which is how you are doing it. So influencers here can be used as a method of you want to build social resiliency by having your influencers go into YouTube and propose these narratives and provide their followers social media resources for fact checking or something like that. And then lastly, the circle is our multiplier, which is now known as an amplifier. And this is basically how are you amplifying that message. So if you're using one tool, is there another tool that works really well with it to send your message out to more people? And then inside the number, or inside each shape is a number that indicates the influence value. So this is another game mechanic. And this is how we basically add up how strong your campaign is. And this ultimately goes into adjudication. So I will quickly pause for questions. Here, I'm quick going through the chat. So Connor, yes, I will share my LinkedIn information at some point. And at the start of the game, are all of the population and or ideology groups the same size? The answer is no. So each of the populations have different size indicators. So we've changed it from percentages of the population to small, medium, or large. And this ultimately has an influence in the game in how many resiliency or malign cubes the population starts out with. And this is kind of just a regulator mechanic in that you have to, if you want to create malign influence within a population, you have to wear them down from their current beliefs. And with more resiliency cubes, this is a representation of larger populations. It's harder to send out your messages and change everybody's mind as compared to a smaller population. It's just like large N versus small n. And one of the cool things about it is that in the game, because it's all chips and the population sizes are chips that you can pull and shift around, we can kind of tinker with how big each population is and how that may shape the outcomes of the game. So I hope that answers your question. I'll do 2 more questions before jumping back into it. What is the player count for the game? Can there be teams? So yes, there can be teams. We've typically, the minimum is 5 players with the current scenario. We would like to design it that we can have 2-player games or 3-player games, but players can work within teams. So I think at most I've had 3 or 4 players per team. But I will say that this is great for having conversations, but I would say in my experience of gaming, as you get larger and larger teams, that means that there's more conversation and potentially infighting, and the decision-making process is a little bit slower. So understanding like the applications of where you want to play that game, or like how you want to play the game, who you're playing it with, and what you want to get out of it is important in considering how big you want the teams. It gets to a certain point, I would say, in this game where once you hit like 4 players per team, I would recommend just running 2 consecutive games, as that's been my experience in the past. That has been my experience so far. And then, is there card trading in the game? So I would say not as a like central mechanic, but we do have opportunities for trading. There are some action cards that basically allow you to ask other players to trade cards with you. And then one of our regime abilities, which I haven't really gotten into yet, regime abilities in short are just unique abilities of each country. So for example, I believe Dynasia's motivation is to establish itself as an economic powerhouse and basically have a seat at the table with the mainland. So they want to promote trade, and that is part of their regime ability. So there's card trading opportunity. The only other thing I would say about it is that every player has a deck of cards, and they're all like, each player starts with 108 cards, depending on the type of game, and they all have corresponding backings that match the color of their country. So it's a little bit interesting in terms of, you know, who has traded with who. And it introduces an interesting dynamic to the game that I haven't really seen in others. So I hope that answers your question. So I'll jump back into questions a little bit later, but I wanted to show you a few examples of some of the cards in the deck. So my favorite card is the honeypot. So it has a definition here. The honeypot, where trapper entices a target into a false relationship to gain sensitive information or access. This is an action card, but I still like creating a narrative depending on who's playing it within the game and how the game is ultimately going. And this shows you how this translates into game mechanics. So they have to roll a dice to see if they fall into the honey pot. If they roll equal or less than a 6, because this is a D10, they must discard 4 cards. So they have to take a risk here. And if they fall for the honey pot, you gain an advantage. The middle card is the social divisions. So this is an example of a purely malign intent card. And it just indicates in terms of game mechanics that you should notify the facilitator and let people know when you reveal the card which demographic you're targeting. So for every campaign, you have to target a particular demographic and shape your narrative around that, which I'll give you an example in I believe 1 or 2 slides here. And then the influencers card, which I showed you is a very dynamic card in that it can be used as both a malign influence or a social resilience. It can only be one or the other at any given time, but it can also be a method or an amplifier. And again, it can only be one or the other within any particular campaign. So we give players flexibility in terms of how they use particular cards. And this helps them think creatively. Waiting for the next slide to load. Okay, so the placemats are where the players use the cards. And this is an updated placemat. And this was redesigned recently just to make it a little more digestible and like help players understand the flow of the game. So over in the top left, they'll have their operations deck. So this is the deck of cards that they're playing with in the game. And this can range from anywhere between 108 cards to 30, depending on how you want to play the game. And this is something that we've been experimenting with in the development. So at the outset of the game, we had the players start with the 108 cards and then take time to build a deck of 30. And this would be a mix of action cards, intent, method, and multiplier, resiliency, and malign, which 108 cards, giving you 20 minutes, it can be overwhelming. Especially because some of our first players were university students over in Helsinki. So they were understanding like the nuances of the game while I was fire hosing them with information, very much like what I'm doing to you now. And it was a little bit overwhelming. So then we shifted to an alternative game style where we pre-built, the facilitators pre-built a deck of 30 cards for the players. And they were allowed to work with all 30 cards. In the situation where they built the deck of 30 themselves, we would shuffle it and make them draw 5 from their hand and work with those cards over the course of the game. So on one hand, if they built the deck themselves, that gives them flexibility in choosing overarching strategies, but they had to shuffle it. So it accounts for like the randomness in the world and potentially being constrained just by what's going on in the world around you. And this encouraged players to think creatively within the scope that they set for themselves at the beginning of the game. On the other hand, the strategy where the facilitators built the deck of 30 cards for all of the players, which would be different for every player based on the country and their overarching objectives, the players had a bigger hand to work with, as in all 30 cards that they can build their perfect strategies, but we scoped it at the beginning of the game. So within our rule books, we've offered both of those and ultimately leave it up to facilitators and understanding what you want players to get out of the game. So then moving down, we have just a brief definition of a country. So ardent, strong democratic values face the push and pull of domestic politics while international threats loom on its borders. So this is just adding a little bit of flavor, helping players think about like, what would my country think if another country did a malign influence campaign that targeted my democracy or something like that. And then down here in the left corner, there is indicators of income. So this is how players essentially pay for their campaigns. Their campaigns aren't free. So each player starts with a certain number of yellow cubes, just representing money, time, energy. And over the course of the game, they get a few more. So Arden starts with 2 and gets 2 every turn. This isn't the same for every country. Some are richer, some are not so much. And this kind of constrains players and helps them think about like what they can do. And if they want to do a high value campaign that's high cost, they may need to save and think about their strategy over the course of a few different turns. So then in the middle here, of course, we have the country name, but then we have 2 rows for players to lay down their campaigns. And this is hopefully intuitive for the players in that they match the shapes to the shapes within the cards. And this helps them think about the linear structure of their campaign, what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, and if I so choose, how I'm amplifying that message. And over the course of the game, you'll lay your campaign in the first row. In the next turn, it shifts down to row 2. And by the third turn, it moves off the board. So players can't just, if they really like a campaign, they just can't do it over and over and over again. They become a little bit more constrained and have to think creatively about the campaigns that they can work with using the cards in their hand. So then up in the top right corner, they have the option of doing an action card. So they can choose to do an action card instead of laying out a campaign. Players get a limited selection of what they can do within each turn. And an action card is one of those options, or they can activate their, like I mentioned before, their regime ability. So Arden's unique ability is national unity. So they can choose, instead of laying out a new campaign or using an action card, they can choose to roll a dice, and it's a D10. So if they roll a 4 or less, they get to remove 1 malign cube from any of their population demographics. So this is a risk that you're rolling a dice and you don't really have a strong chance, but it has a good payoff in that malign cubes are pretty stubborn to remove in the mechanics of the game. So players can opt to do this. And this may even be something that they strategize to save their income to play a high value campaign later. And then lastly, we have the discard. So as campaigns or action cards are used, they move into the discard pile. Once the player uses their entire operations deck, we simply just reshuffle the discard if we're playing a game that they draw. If we're not doing a game where they draw, then we just shuffle it, or it just goes back into their hand. They don't even need to shuffle. So I kind of walked through this because I got ahead of myself. But this is an example of what a player mat would look like during a game. So the top row is their campaign that they most recently laid out. And Arden, in this instance, is targeting Ursaria People Party. So they essentially have to structure a narrative that they think would align with a malign influence campaign targeting a political party in an authoritarian regime, because this is the information that the players are given over the course of the game. So we have the intent, which is malign influence, the method, which is online radicalization. So this is introducing and indoctrinating an individual or group to extreme ideological message or belief system. So this can be, what the players want. They can say they want to indoctrinate the Ursaria People's Party, that their leader is, in this case, they can use a conspiracy theory and say that their leader is like from the lizard people population. It can be a little bit crazy, but it also has to be slightly realistic. But I also say this thinking about the fact that birds aren't real was a conspiracy theory that came out during 2020. So the flexibility within the narratives is pretty good. And then the bottom row is an example of a resiliency campaign. So this is Arden targeting its own population, and it's targeting those demographics that have less than a high school education. They probably want to bolster this population's confidence in the government by providing electoral security. So they're probably going to ensure people that if they're doing online voting, that it's safe from hacking, provide literature and those types of things. And they're also going to deplatform people that are probably just spreading lies. So this is a very broad example of what campaigns would look like on the board. And I'll go through this a little bit more in depth, but for each of these, you would sum the values of the influence values, and this would lead to the adjudication. So the top row campaign value, if I can do public math, is 7 + 4, 11. And when we go to the effects results table, this is a medium value campaign, and it would cost Arden 2 resources to activate it, which I go into in a couple of slides, but this is another example. So this is the old placemat that the players used. And this was, I was playing Fluma. So I had activated my bottom row campaign, which was a resiliency campaign to bolster my independence movement. I was attributing resources and I was using grassroots mobilization. So this is something where maybe I reach out to local libraries to have them hang posters to understand like how to look up resources, to better inform yourself about the information that's out on the internet and knowing where it's coming from. And this top row is a campaign that I had not yet activated. So players, when they choose to reveal a campaign, will flip over the cards. Everything is done secretly until showtime, I would say. So then going a little bit more into the adjudication, this is that malign influence campaign I talked about earlier. So you would sum the values, and in this case, I was wrong on the previous slide, not because I can't do math, but there's an important caveat. So you add the intent, method, multiplier, because online radicalization is being used as the method, you use that value. You do not use both of them. But when online radicalization is used with conspiracy theory, you also add an additional 2 points. So this basically represents that some tools are notably, like, they work well together. So online radicalization and conspiracy theories, as we've learned in literature review and interviews, often come in pairs. But this is only to help guide players. This is not to say that online radicalization must be paired with conspiracy theory every time. If you have a creative use for conspiracy theory that works with other cards, or just works on its own because it is a method, which I am now looking at it and realizing that it is not an amplifier. So these would likely be switched. So apologies for that. I hope that doesn't confuse you more. In this case, online radicalization would be used as the amplifier, but the score would stay the same. They would just switch positions on the board. And I've already given an example of what this narrative would look like. So I'm going to talk about this narrative, and then I will dive into a few more questions here. So as I've been harping on over the course of this presentation, the most important aspect of the game is the story that the players tell. So this is I would say the players interact with the cards to shape their narrative, and everything in the game is intended to help them think about that story and build it themselves. So the map is fictional. So the players have that flexibility of, they don't have to anchor themselves into what would the United States do or what would Russia do. They can flex around that, tell new stories, think creatively. I've heard people relate stories about Marine Le Pencil, which, you know, they draw on the real world parallels, but they can be a little bit silly. The demographics, those are intended to help players understand like what types of information may be more effective against particular demographics or different types of political parties, and their victory conditions. So each player is given unique victory conditions that get to their country's aim. So it may be resolving a territorial dispute in their favor, or in the current narrative, it may be reuniting the empire or establishing yourself as an economic powerhouse by building relations with every country. And these are all intended to help the players build those stories, and ultimately engage with the tools of malign influence and resiliency and piece them together. So the world is our oyster, the cards help guide them, and everything else there is intended to help guide them towards thinking about those cards and the stories that they can weave. And another important component of this is that even though I've told you creative and a little bit crazy stories about lizard people and birds aren't real, if players don't believe the narratives, we provide every player a card that is this one over here on the right, that is like, you can slap it on the table and you're like, this is unbelievable. I don't think it will work. And it's not intended to be a strategic thing where you're blocking a campaign because you don't like it. It's supposed to be, I don't think this narrative or this campaign would actually happen in the real world. And then we have very brief conversation about why or why not. Players may bring in examples from the real world, and then everybody gets to vote. And if the story is voted to be too crazy, the campaign is discarded. So it's a little bit of a punishment mechanic to make sure that players aren't just gaming the game and trying to win by slapping the cards on the table, because that's not the point. And as I've mentioned before, the game's pieces are designed to be flexible to test out different scenarios. So this game was, and the scenario itself, were actually designed prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So it ended up very much reflecting what's going on in the world, a Russia-Ukraine scenario. So we have Ursaria wanting to reunite the empire with Arden. We have Fluma with a strong separatist movement that can be swayed one way or the other. And it's nice because the game is designed in a way that the victory conditions and the demographics can be changed easily. So like I mentioned before, the sizes of the populations are not fixed, nor are any of the other characteristics of these countries. It's, the victory conditions are a Word document that I have been revising, I would say, probably every 3 months or so, just to make sure that they work. Players can easily understand them, but we can just shift the narratives. And the demographics are chips that we lay out at the outset of the game. So we can switch out political parties, ethnicities, population sizes, and essentially tinker with it to entertain other case studies. So a few things, just as a game designer, that I have learned over the process of this game. One of the coolest things is understanding the applications of a fictional world and testing realistic scenarios. So we did this in part because we wanted to make sure nobody got offended. So I make these parallels to Russia and the United States. And I thought about countries in the real world when I was creating these fictional ones. But one of the coolest things is that not all of the players see the same countries that I did in designing the game. And that's kind of a reflection of like how flexible this game is and the narratives that the players can tell. So I've had players think of Fluma as the separatist, or I don't want to say separatist, but like the Catalan region in Spain, where it has a very different identity from the country that it is a part of. And Arden has been related to Ukraine, but I was thinking about the United States when designing the bipartisan system. So it has that huge range of different countries that it can represent, that can be informed by player perspectives and the way that they play the game. So this was a very exciting prospect. Additionally, the number of assets versus flexibility. So like I said before, we used to use percentage counters for the population sizes. And we had, as you can see on this old version of the map, each of them had 5 PDs. So some of them had 15% of the population, 75% of the population, and it's a ton of chips on the board. And we still have a ton of chips on the board, but we're not willing to sacrifice the degree of flexibility that provides. Like I mentioned before, we can wipe the board, throw on new chips, and test out a new scenario. So understanding the game that you want to design and the flexibility, as well as how many counters are you willing to cut out, and the other mechanics of the game that provide that flexibility and that dynamic. This is also something I kind of mentioned earlier in terms of an exploratory game versus time. So, I've spent probably 45 minutes talking your ear off about this game, and you'd probably still need a bit of a walkthrough of like what a turn would look like and things like that. So the game is a little bit complex at face value, and it typically requires a facilitator. So as a game designer, one of the things that I've learned is nobody reads the read aheads. So we can send out the rules, but players are still going to be confused. And ensuring that players take the time to learn the mechanics of the game is important to ensure that they get down to the learning of the game and understanding like how much time they need to explore the cards, build their narratives, and like sit down and think about the problem that's ahead of in front of them. And there's one example where I walked into the room prepared to facilitate this game, take like 2 to 3 hours, and then I learned I had 90 minutes. So it was one of those where understanding like how to appropriately communicate this game, how it works, and ensure that players have enough time to actually get to the crux of what we want to talk about, which is the tools of malign, influence, resiliency, and how the players can piece them together. So the game I've also explained is a very, it's simplified as compared to when we started. So we had mechanics for alliances, and then we had social sliding scales. So this was like different representation of their government, public opinion, how willing the government was to engage with other countries, as well as to engage with its constituents. And we decided like a lot of these mechanics were redundant or built into the game through other mechanics. So alliances are not a formal mechanic in the game, but the way that we've structured the victory conditions, as well as the player narratives, kind of encourages alliances in particular ways. And it's very much, we wanted to make sure that this fire hose of information was only a fire hose as much as it needed to be. And then lastly, with victory conditions, we had to think about how do we best incentivize the players to have the interactions that would encourage this learning that we wanted them to get out of the game. So this is actually a little bit outdated in that it used to be rack and stack points. So as many malign and resiliency cubes that you managed to get on the board translated directly into victory points. But with the fact that you ultimately have some significant chance within the game. So I will say that I did not talk about this in depth, but the effects results table, players built their campaigns, they have a value. This translates into a matrix that if you roll a D10 and you score and the dice is a particular value, is either a failure or a success. And that translates into the number of cubes that you get to put on the board. So it used to be how many dice rolls did you roll successfully? which is fairly not good if players are spinning these really good stories that are really engaging the tools, but they just aren't good at throwing dice. But now we've moved more towards achievement unlocked mechanics, so that players, even though they have that element of random dice rolls still in the game, it's not, if they do particular strategic actions within the game, they still get points. And this also prevents players from just targeting a single vulnerable, super small population and just dumping cubes on it. So if they achieve an easy objective in a small population, achievement unlocked, they get those points, they move on to a more difficult objective, and they can strategize which objectives they want to accomplish over the course of the game. So then, just going briefly over where we have played this game, the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, aka Hybrid COE, is essentially an international organization that helps essentially address the issues that this game also addresses. They reached out to us, and that was part of the reason why we designed this game, was that Hybrid COE did not know of other games, and Sebastian, being Sebastian, was like, ah, yes, let us design a game, and assembled the team for this and designed it. So they bring us over to Europe. We played the game for Aalto University and Lorraine University, as I mentioned with some of the pictures. We've had a bunch of playtests through Steam's tabletop simulator. I will caveat that it has not been updated yet, so we are more than happy to run playtests, but we just have to update it. I'm sure if there's enough demand, I can bug Sebastian into doing that once he's back from vacation. I have played this with my friends in the Pittsburgh board gaming community. So the picture up in the top right is them sitting in my house playing the game, which was really interesting because they are not university students studying communication, as many of the students we've had play for through Hybrid COE have been. They've made a lot of references to Magic the Gathering and understanding how to build the game, the decks of cards that they were playing with. And they also stayed at my house until 1 a.m. So it really gave me insight into the playability and the enjoyment of the game. We also participated in a disinformation event in Riga, Latvia. So this was also through Hybrid COE. Connections Netherlands. We also did Connections DC. Important note there. The Hague University, and we've also played this for the European Commission, as well as Friends of Europe in Brussels. So top picture are my friends in Pittsburgh. Left picture is us in Helsinki, Finland. That's Grace and I, as well as my cat the day after cleanup in the bottom right. So the game is enjoyed, hopefully, by many. And what's next? So in a couple of weeks, I will be heading to Warsaw to participate in another disinformation conference, as well as wargame for Hybrid COE. And we have interest from the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as their universities, to help train their media teams, I believe. I may be butchering that. And there are tentative plans to go to Austria, as well as Georgia, the country, for sharing this game for university students and helping people understand these problems. And as I've shown with some of the modifications and edits, the game is hopefully going to be in a box, and we are hopefully going towards publication. But this game has very much been a work in progress for the past 2 years, that I have to say thank you to everyone that has already played this game, if there are any in the chat, and I look forward to hearing your questions and sharing more about the game if you're interested. So thank you so much. And I will go through some of the questions. So easy question, my cat's name is Ginkgo. I am surprised that he has not jumped up on my camera today. So let me find. All right. So Joelle's question, is there a currently published game that Malign is similar to, assume a reasonable amount of tabletop game knowledge? So this was part of the problem, and I'm still a little tentative in saying this, but I don't think there are other games out there quite like this. Like, I know Rand has had some games about influence and gray zone. There are some published open reports that I was not part of that are somewhat similar, but not educational games aimed at this particular, I would say, demographic. And this is part of the reason why we designed Malign, was that we didn't see games filling that space. But I have been constantly searching. So if people think of games, please send them my way, because I think sharing that information is not only valuable for us, but just the broader community. Oh, Lizard and Lies. Cool. I'm going to have to check that out. Nice. So thank you for that, Rex. And Influence Inc. Cool. Thank you. I would say this is very good for me. Rex, you and I should chat at some point, because it seems like you are a wealth of knowledge on this. So Connor's question, with narrative construction in control of players, what stops players from wanting to play or say the narrative is unbelievable to gain control? So to then gain control to narrate. If I'm understanding your question correctly, this is something that the veto card is valuable for in terms of players self-regulating. I would say that the facilitator is also a presence. And we would ultimately like the game to not need a facilitator, but it's then ultimately up to the players themselves to regulate. So because this is an educational game and not like an off-the-shelf board game, it's essentially assumed that players come in with an understanding of what they're intended to do in the game. Like, it's definitely supposed to be a game that's fun, but like, you need to also have kind of like that code of conduct. I hope that answers your question. How many duplicates? Off the top of my head, I actually don't know, but there are duplicates of primarily the intent cards. I would say there's a few draw cards, but most of the other cards within the deck, which is 108 cards, are unique within a player deck, and all players have the same deck, just individually. Okay, so reading Patrick's comment or question, thank you for saying the game is really well thought out. Have you considered having an option for a facilitator to be a game master representing a control team or referee who adjusts the D10 results on a scale that weighs them according to how well the teams develop their narratives for the moves? It could also substitute for the veto mechanic. This is really interesting. I would say this kind of works, I don't want to say contrary, but like, if we continue to use a facilitator, I think this is very fair in terms of if players are spinning these really good stories, we can add, like, say, like add +2 to your dice roll. And I think this is completely fair. I would say because that has happened in the past where the players have basically gotten wrecked because of bad dice rolls, we've adjusted the effects results table. So the effects results table used to be very difficult to have a successful campaign because there are, an easy example is that there are probably 2 Twitter bots just arguing at each other on Twitter into oblivion. And they may be, you know, a Russian bot versus a Russian bot. There are probably hundreds and hundreds of campaigns going on that we're not even aware of. But this was not fun for players because they just kept rolling dice and they weren't doing anything successful. They were losing their cards. and it ultimately ended up being frustrating. So we've had to make that adjustment within the game to make it an engaging and fun game. But I think that what you're saying is a very fair point. We're hoping that we built the mechanics to kind of substitute for that and substitute for having that like in-depth facilitator. But the game is open and flexible for that. Let me see. Was a bidding system considered in this design process for sides or certain cards? So you may need to clarify what a bidding system is for me. Like my assumption is that the players would basically be willing to sacrifice X amount of cards, or present themselves with particular constraints enabled to be able to get particular different types of cards. I would say that we did not consider that, if that is actually what you're talking about. I'm ultimately not sure the bidding mechanic. I'm going to quick scroll. Okay, yes. So I would say we definitely did not do that. And I don't think we really considered it, which is, it's interesting because I think on one hand, it would be a way that players would like be drawn to bidding higher for cards that they're familiar with, and seeing how much players are willing to bet on those types of cards would be really interesting. But just from that type of mechanic off of the top of my head, it doesn't really seem like it fits within the way that we want the players to interact with the cards. So that's the long answer, but I think the short answer is no, but I would definitely be interested in learning more. Joelle, thanks for the easy questions. I appreciate it. So RAND is one of our offices is based in Pittsburgh. So we have the DC office, which is, I'm sure, very close to Goose, and Georgetown in general. I was there for a couple of years. That's how I met Sebastian and many of the other people on the team. But I am based in Pittsburgh. Happy to, if anybody has questions about RAND, more than happy to chat about that as well. And Sebastian was also formerly at RAND, now at CNA. I will also note that I just go into these things assuming everybody knows Sebastian J, professor at Georgetown, formerly at RAND, now at CNA. He is the lead game designer for Malign. So question in the game, are some countries, groups more resilient than others? And if so, how is this achieved in the game? So overall, countries are intended to be balanced, just in terms of resiliency and malign influence that happens before the players start the game. But the different populations are, depending on their size, as well as like, I would say, just like the characteristics provided in the narrative they start out with more resiliency cubes. So like I mentioned before, this is kind of like, if it's a large population, it's really hard to get a message across the entire population. So the countries themselves are not, like one is not super strong relative to the other ones. We tried to balance this out just in terms of everyone that typically plays the game, I would say, starts on like a level playing field. In terms of publishing, how will you publish? Crowdfunding or publisher? I think our initial route is going to be publisher. Because this is an educational game, I don't think that actually factors into it at all. I think I don't know which one's actually easier, and this process is entirely new to me. Sebastian went through crowdfunding, I believe, or simultaneously crowdfunding and publisher. So I can't say that I'm very familiar with it, but I think we're going to go for publisher, at least at the outset. See if they bite. So, oh, okay. Oh, sorry, Natalie, I didn't see your reading chunk, but thank you. Another game recommendation, Once Upon a Time. Playing a game with player-controlled narratives. Yeah, this is something that I'm really interested in. Here, I will actually just pop to this slide. So this slide just provides some of the inspirations that we thought about while we were designing this game. It also has the list of some of the tools that we use. All of these tools are free, so I would say don't be discouraged if finding money to design a game is an issue. I will say that printing the game is a little bit more expensive, but designing it online, I managed to do it all for free. But some of the inspirations that we used were pandemic. So influence, you may have thought about this where I was talking about cubes ending up in different populations. Root is competing factions. The Quiet Year was, I have not played The Quiet Year, but I've heard very good things in terms of the narrative. So I do really appreciate getting other recommendations. I would say that even though I'm a game designer, I am relatively new to the board gaming world in terms of I own a few board games, but talking to some of my friends or even talking to Sebastian, it sounds like people have game design libraries. So thank you for the recommendations. Did you notice a significantly stronger appreciation for resilience moves among Eastern European players? So I would say not directly. I would say on the one hand, or like on the other side, the players that represented Ursaria were very aggressive with their malign influence campaigns, and you could see the parallels on that front. I think one of the gameisms is that players like to be mean because you can in a game without being, without walking away with too many hurt feelings. Like it's fun to be mean and create these like kind of wild, but also like realistic malign influence campaigns. Like thinking about what you see on Twitter, like malign influence is very much in your face. And I think that resiliency is difficult. And one of the reasons like why this is an educational game where you have to use resiliency is like players understanding and identifying those tools that may not be as in your face as some of the crazy conspiracy theories and, bots fighting on Twitter. So I would say I have not seen a difference relative to other players directly. But I would say the conversations that we've had about the implications for Eastern European players, and like when I was playing it in Latvia, understanding their perceptions of the game and the implications it has for the country and the threats that they face relative to, players in the United States and the threat perceptions that they have about malign influence is very different. And honestly, like inspiring to me. So it makes me very excited as a gamer, and also makes me want to engage in the issues whenever I share this game and the players share their perspectives with me. So that's just my little heartfelt tangent. Appreciate the endorsements for Root and Quiet Year. Yeah, and designing a cross asymmetrical game because of Root, I really appreciate you all sharing your game designs, game suggestions. It's awesome. And this is just me sending my love to Goose, because Goose is one of the reasons why I had the opportunity to help design this game. So I will put my LinkedIn in the chat. Oh, my screen sharing's paused. I don't know if I can use LinkedIn while doing this. So here, I will stop sharing my screen for the moment so that I can actually do this and help you all. And I appreciate the LinkedIn ads. But feel free to add in any other questions. Otherwise, I will drop my link in the chat and let you all get to your evening. There we go. And I'll say thank you so much for, taking the time and letting me share our game with you.